gave you the handout of chapter 8 and the picture of the tabernacle, the diagram. We started there last week. Remember, we're in the book of Hebrews, written to Christians who were previously Jews, who were starting to slide away back into Judaism and renounce their Christianity. And so the writer writes this letter to them, which has application to us today, of course, also. Remember, the book of Hebrews is better. That's all you got to remember is better. Everything is better than the new is better than the old. And I always try to start with a quick review. You should keep it in your brain. Repetition helps. Chapters 1 and 2, Christ is better than the angels. And of course, the Jews had a high thinking of angels. They had a high regard for angels. So Christ was better than angels. Chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 3, Christ is better than Moses, which was their leader. Chapter 4 is that chapter talking about the rest that the Israelites, when they disobeyed God, did not get, and the rest that we won't get if we do the same thing, or the rest you can attain if you are obedient. And the Israelites that were obedient obtained rest. And of course, the application to us as we can. Chapter 5, he states, the writer writes that Christ is greater than the high priest. He's kind of going down the line. The high priest was obviously very powerful and very important in the Jewish religion, but Christ is greater than the high priest. Then chapter 6 and forward for a while talks about the new covenant, Christ. In chapter 7 especially, Christ's priesthood is greater than the high priest, and of course it's more on the order of Melchizedek. And then he talks about the new covenant being greater than the old covenant, and he talks about it in different facets. So that's where we are. We go down to chapter 8. Last week we got the first couple of verses started, but let's pick up at chapter 8 and verse 1, where he says, "Now this is the sum, this is the summary, this is the completeness, the result of everything we've talked about previously in the previous chapters. We have a high priest who sat on the right hand of the throne of God of heavens, a minister of the sanctuary of the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched and not man." So he sums it up by saying, I'm telling you all this in chapters 5 and 6 and 7. Of course, there weren't chapters then, but that this is the sum. We have a high priest sitting on the right hand of God, serving you. And contrasting that with the Old Testament priest who stood to do their service, and they were temporary. When they died, they were out. They were replaced by someone else in their family. But here, Christ is forever our high priest. He talks about him being a minister of the sanctuary and the true tabernacle. And I put in your handout because the true tabernacle is a church. The true tabernacle now is the church, and your handout has the types and antitypes, the things that foreshadowed the future, the most heavenly place, holy place, the showbread, the candlestick, the altar of incense, the laver, where they washed themselves, and the altar of burnt sacrifices. And there's a type for each one of them. They're the type. They're the foreshadowing of the future. Antitype is where we are now, the real thing. And the holy place is now the church, which is the real tabernacle. That's where we got down to last week, I believe. We'll talk about some of those again, I believe, in chapter 9. Because a lot of this is repeated over and over in different arguments. And in verse 3 of chapter 8, he says, "For every high priest," talking about the Mosaic law, Old Testament law, was ordained or authorized to offer gifts and sacrifices. We know that. But it's necessity that this man have something else to offer himself. He's talking about Jesus. And what he has to offer is himself. We discussed he's the priest and the sacrifice. He has dual roles there. It's kind of an interesting concept. But the Levitical priests did theirs as they were authorized by the law. Christ, who's the antitype, offered himself all time for everyone. And in verse 4, it says, he's talking about Christ here. For if he were on earth, he should not be a priest. And of course, on earth he could not be a priest. He was a tribe of Judah, not the tribe of Levi. Seeing there are priests that offer gifts according to the law. So again, he was not Levitical, he was Judah tribe, so he could not be a priest. We also know he didn't want to be a king on earth. Remember in John 6, the people want to make him king, and he does not want that designation on earth. He's not a king, he's not a priest while on earth. But of course in heaven, after his ascension, he is king and priest. And of course, like Melchizedek, he had no predecessor and no successor. He still serves. And then verse 5 talks about the high priest briefly. He says, they serve as an example. American Standard says a copy. Some of your versions may say copy. And a shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. So these priests served as a type, copy, shadow. All these words kind of mean the same thing, of something better to come, which would be the gospel system. Turn your page over to chapter 10, verse 1. Just turn your page. It says, verse 1 of chapter 10, for the law having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of things to come. So the law was a shadow. It wasn't the real thing. It was a type looking forward to the real antitype later. But the law could never, with those sacrifices offered year after year continually, make the comers approved perfect. Could not make them perfect. And of course, we discussed that, and we'll discuss it again. The law Old Testament law just rolled over their sins until Christ could come and redeem them. And then he says in the end of that verse 5, he quotes Exodus 25:40, when God tells Moses, make all things according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. And that's a big passage, Exodus 25:40. You want to remember that passage because it's talking about the tabernacle pattern. God gave him exact, you got your hand out in front of you, the picture of the tabernacle. The pattern had to be the same. It was mentioned last week in 1 Chronicles 28 and other places, the temple pattern was given. 1 Chronicles 28, the temple pattern. So the tabernacle pattern, the temple pattern, and they are foreshadowing, they're types. They're the shadow of the ultimate pattern to be given for the church, which we have now. And its patterns are important. God lays out what he wants, and we follow it. I put on your handout there, a type is anything that is a something or an image of what's to come later. Type, antitype being the real thing. Greek word there is tupos, T-U-P-O-S. The antitype is the genuine thing. Greek word is antitupon, A-N-T-I-T-U-P-O-N. And again, that's the real McCoy. And that's what we're talking about here. So all these types are foreshadowing of things that will happen in the future. are now here. I put on your handout similar meaning for type, for pattern, example, shadow. All these things they're talking about things that were important, were given by God, but they were there to foreshadow the future, the antitype later. What does God give us a pattern? Even whether it's Old Testament or New Testament, He gave a pattern of how to be saved, salvation. Pattern is there. He gives patterns on worship, whether it was Old Testament, whether it was New Testament, New Covenant, how to do it according to His rules. And then living, how we live, how they lived, how we live every day. He gives a pattern, and we need to understand that's God is a God of patterns, and it's one thing that Hebrews teaches us really over and over of the patterns that are important. Any thoughts on the first 5 verses before we go any further, or comments? Must be real easy to understand. I wrote on your handout Colossians 2:16 and 17. Colossians 2:16 and 17, he writes, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or drink or any holiday or feast day or any new moon or Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come. But the body is of Christ." So again, emphasizing that those Old Testament rules were just a shadow. They were important. They were there for a reason. They were there to teach God's people to follow the rules, to get used to understanding what sin is and how sin hurts God, and but also prepare them for the real thing to come later, the New Covenant, which most of them did not get. Obviously, some of the Jews were converted because he's writing to them here in the book of Hebrews. Let's go to verse 6. He's talking about, but now he, this is Jesus Christ, has obtained a more excellent ministry, by how also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises. So you get the word better here. You get the word in this verse here. You get Jesus obtained a more excellent, a better ministry, a better covenant, better promises. So that one verse summarizes pretty much the book of Hebrews. And he's a mediator. He's the one we've talked. Somebody turn to 1 Timothy 2 in verse 15. Is that the right verse? 2:5, I'm sorry. 1 Timothy 2, verse 5, I'm sorry. 1 Timothy 2, verse 5, there is one God, one mediator between God and man, Christ Jesus. And of course, that concept we have of God up here and man down here, and you had that great relationship initially in the Garden of Eden. It didn't last very long, and after sin came into the world, it cut that off, and God devised a plan for man to be reconciled back to God. Had that discussion before. Be reconciled. To be brought back into that right relationship with God. So now that you have that, and you are a Christian, you've been reconciled back, you have this mediator between man and God, and that would be Jesus Christ, our mediator, our person who's our someone who's in your corner helping you out. And of course, in 1 John, it's called our advocate. 1 John chapter 2, I believe, he says he's our advocate. He's it's like your lawyer arguing for you before the court, before God's court. So Jesus is our mediator and our advocate. And all that is better than the old system. Sure, you had high priests and they were doing things and they were offering sacrifices, but this is better because back then you had to have the high priest as your mediator. So we got through verse 6. I love that. More excellent ministry, better covenant, better promises. Then he says in verse 7, if the first covenant, this is the Old Testament law, had been faultless, other versions say free from defect, but if it had been perfect or not had any flaws in it or defects, there's no place for the second one. You wouldn't have to have a second covenant. Of course, we know it wasn't. I put that in your handout. Faultless is free from defect, lacking nothing. But the Old Testament law could not cleanse our sins. A couple references. Go to chapter 10. Flip your page over. Again, a lot of this is going to be repeated down the road, but in chapter 10, verses 3 and 4, he's talking about these sacrifices. But in those sacrifices, there's remembrance again made of sins every year. For it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sin. And this is not, we know this because, the Old Testament law just once a year on the Day of Atonement, it would just roll those sins forward. They would be atoned for temporarily, but roll forward on credit, we like to say. And the credit bill is every year. You ain't got to pay it yet, but it's still being rolled over. At some point, it has to be paid. And, of course, we'll find out in chapter 9 especially, where the blood of Christ, when he came and shed his blood, washed all that credit away. Clean. He paid the bill. That's what we think about it. It was all paid off for us, for them. And the law itself couldn't do it. In Acts 13, you'll turn your Bible back to Acts 13. If you recall, Acts 13 is the beginning of the first missionary journey of Paul and Barnabas. And you get beginning in verse 16, you get the beginning of Paul's first sermon that's recorded. And verses 16 through 41 is Paul's sermon. This is around Acts 13, AD 45 or so. And you get down to around he gives this long sermon about everything, kind of summarizing it all. And you get down to around verse 38, 39. He says, "Be it known to you, therefore, men and brethren, that through this man," this is Jesus Christ, "is preached to you forgiveness of sins. And by him all that believe are justified from all things from which you could not be justified by the law of Moses." So again, this is AD 45 or so, first missionary journey. And he's at Antioch of Pisidius, where they landed here, or they're at in preaching in the synagogues. And he gives his first big sermon and says, because of Jesus Christ now, he's preaching to the Jews. You you can be justified fully, which you could not be by the law of Moses. And if you read on down, a lot of them liked what he had to say and brought him back the next Sabbath day to preach. So you have this principle of better covenant because it can forgive sins, whereas the old covenant could not. Old Testament would require perfection, which you can't do. Nobody could keep that law except Jesus. And it was done through mortal men. The word carnal comes up a lot because meat, flesh. You had men who were just regular. They were priests, but they were just regular men. They were going to die. They had their own sins. And then they had the animal sacrifices and things that were fleshly as opposed to Jesus, who's more spiritual. Then you get to verse 8, and really 8 through 12 on your handout is a quote from Jeremiah. Your handout, it should say Jeremiah 31 through 34. I can't remember what the original says there. If there's a mistake, it's Jeremiah 31 through 34. And when this writer of Hebrews, writing to Jewish Christians who were Jews all their lives, uses a lot of Old Testament references, obviously, because you're trying to show where they were predicting or prophesying what was going to happen. But this passage here, he's telling them, all what I'm telling you shouldn't shock you. Jeremiah lived about 620s BC, ballpark, 625 to 605 BC. So you're in this range. He was contemporary with Habakkuk. They were contemporaries, a minor prophet, Habakkuk. And, 600 years prior to this writing, Jeremiah told the Jews this. He quotes it. So it should not be a shock. He says in verse 8, he said to them, "Behold," this is quoting Jeremiah 31, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. So this was 600 years prior to Christ coming, that Jeremiah writes about a new covenant that will come later. Verse 9, not according to the covenant I made with their fathers when I led them out of Egypt. It's not the same covenant that I made with them, because they continued not in that covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. So the old covenant, they did not keep. It was begun when he brought them out of Egypt and gave it to Moses. Moses lived about 1500 BC, gives you a ballpark. It's when that Old Testament covenant was given. But they didn't keep it. So God, in essence, washed his hands of them. In verse 10, for this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. This is the new house of Israel. Hebrews 8, verse 10. This is the covenant I will make with the new house of Israel, which is another name for the church. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts, and I will be a God, and they'll be my people. So he's telling, Jeremiah is writing 600 BC that this new covenant will be given to the house of Israel after those days. I will put my laws in their mind and write them in their hearts. You know, it was back in the old law was written, scrolls, you followed it exactly. And the New Testament, New Covenant will be written in our hearts. It's more spiritual than physical. Your handout sort of has a summary there of the Old Covenant, emphasizing outward matters, things you had to do physically and routinely. Routinely. You know, the regular priest had to go into the tabernacle, or later on in the temple, same pattern, twice a day. And they had to, the candlesticks had to be oil added to it, make sure they're still burning. So twice a day they went in there to do that. Every Sabbath, once a week, they had to change the bread out. We'll get into that more into that in chapter 9. The showbread had to be changed once a week. So they had daily jobs, the priests did. They had weekly responsibilities, monthly, and then yearly, because once a year was the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. But the outward matters, these things you just had to do, all the animal sacrifices. And then, back then, in verse 10, read verse 11, before we go any further. It says, they shall not teach every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for all shall know me from the least to the greatest. What the point here is, it's on your handout. Back then, we discussed this before, I think, but if you're a Jew, if you were a Jew under the Old Testament law, you were born into God's people.
They were in a covenant relationship through circumcision.
Yes.
And so the Jews maintained the thought of all of this physical thing that had to be done in order for them to reap the final reward, so to speak. Is the way I look at it. So, and that's why all those physical things had to be done in order for them. But as time went on, from the time of Moses all the way up into this present time, it seems to me, because of the way of the teaching of Hebrews, that he is going back over this again for them. And that's why he says, I'm going to make the new covenant is with Judah and with Israel. And we're going to write it on your heart this time.
Mm-hmm.
But it was all physical for
right.
them. And he's trying to...
Physical versus spiritual.
He was trying to explain to them that, hey, just because you was born a Jew and you in a covenant relationship through circumcision, that won't hold water now, so to speak.
Right. Like Anthony said, you were born a Jew. You were born into royalty for whatever, you were born into God's family. You were automatically born once you were circumcised in day 8 or whatever. But see, later on, you had to be taught. A baby can't be taught the Jewish religion. It takes years of teaching to get them understanding. But a Christian now, under the New Testament, you are taught. It is a taught religion. And then you are born. It's opposite. And you have to be taught to understand the gospel. And then you are born again through water baptism, completing your salvation. It's interesting, almost like a type and antitype, but I guess it's just a contrast. Their flesh mattered. you were born into the family. You got the genes. Here, it's a spiritual teaching to change your soul. And you were spiritually born again. So your handout says, "O covenant, outward matters," like Anthony was talking about. You're born, then you're taught. The sins remembered every year, rolled over every year, Day of Atonement. They were not ever forgiven. They were just rolled over. And it began when they came out of Egypt. So when they came out of Egypt, if you imagine Egypt, and they come out of Egypt, they're released with Moses. You're looking about 1500 BC. So this law is going to last all the way until the time of Christ, about 1500 years. That law was going to be in effect.
One more observation.
Yes, sir.
At this point in time, there's a lot of people in this world who believe that all you got to believe is Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and therefore that makes you a Christian, which therefore ensures salvation. So is that not comparative to what Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews, is trying to explain to these Jewish people? Just because of that covenant relationship and you've had that circumcision does not mean that you're going to reap eternal glory. In the same way, a lot of people in this world today who believe they are Christians simply because they believe that Christ is the Son of God is in the same situation as these people were in at that point in time.
That's our Wednesday night class the last couple of weeks, is the teaching of just accept Jesus in your heart presently and you can be saved, not understanding the pattern he's set forth. And that's not this, and he's making the analogy, and Anthony was, that telling the Jews then, just because you were born, it's not good enough anymore. As of AD 33, when the church was established after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, it's all changed. This is done away with. Now we're writing here, the book of Hebrews is in the 60s, AD 60s, early 60s probably. You know what's going to happen in AD 70. I mean, in essence, the Jewish religion is going to end. It's all the temple and the laws, Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple's gone, and all the facets of Jewish worship is gone in AD 70. So for 1,500 years, this law will be in effect, but it's going to come to an end, and Jeremiah wrote about it 600 years prior. Don't forget, if you ever, just for comparison, you remember Isaiah was right at 100 years earlier. He wrote about Jesus coming 700 years prior. Minor prophet that was contemporary with him was Micah. So Isaiah and Micah were preaching the same time, different parts of Israel. And Jeremiah and Habakkuk were preaching about the same time. Remember, Habakkuk's the one who questioned God. He's saying, Habakkuk is saying, why are you, this is 620 BC or so. And of course, in 606 BC, just 14 years later, the Babylonians come in under Nebuchadnezzar and destroy Jerusalem. And Habakkuk was saying, God, why in a couple of years are you going to use this heathen, pagan Nebuchadnezzar, all those evil empire to destroy us? We're bad. We're not following your rules, your laws, but they're worse. But why are you going to use them? And of course, God tells him pretty much what? I'm God. I know what I'm doing. And he uses Nebuchadnezzar to do that. And, of course, he also tells them, God tells them they'll get their due. And they did. They were followed by somebody destroyed them. So it gives you kind of a big picture of where you are. But Jeremiah, he's saying, look, guys, this is in AD 60. 600 years ago, your prophet Jeremiah told you all this was going to happen. There's a better covenant. Why do you want to go back to the old covenant? That doesn't make sense. That's the argument he's making to him. On your handout, the new covenant emphasizes purity, inward, and dedication. Once again, you're taught the Word, and then you're born by water, opposite. Here, under the new covenant with Jesus Christ, your sins are forgiven. They're not rolled over. They're forgiven and also forgotten, which we love that, that God forgets. We don't forget, unfortunately. Or maybe it's fortunate. But as if when you're dealing with each other, that's not good. Not forgetting. We could be like God and forgive and forget. And, of course, all this began at the cross. This began right here when they came out of Egypt, 1500 BC. This began right here with the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and establishment of the church. Verse 12, for I will be merciful. This is the last verse of Jeremiah's writing. He's quoting. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and iniquities I will remember no more. And that's a great thought to know that, that under the new covenant of Jesus Christ, your sins are forgiven and forgotten if you are faithful. So this entire religious system, this whole Jewish religious system, will be done away with. And then right here, finally, actually it was done away with right here, but the whole, even for those who were hanging on, it's going to be gone in AD 70. But think about what is the Old Testament system? Well, it's the Decalogue. It's the Ten Commandments. It's a fancy word for Ten Commandments, because deca means 10. Gone. It's done away with.
Well, that's what he's telling them in verse 13.
Yes.
He said it's about gone. Yeah. It's over with. 10 years later, thereabout, it comes to pass. Verse 13, he's telling them it's going away.
Yep.
It's ready to vanish away.
So all Old Testament law is going to be gone. The priesthood is going to be gone. All the required sacrifices that you had to make, gone. Under the, when the New Testament comes up, you had tabernacle worship, all the things you had to do in a tabernacle, the rituals. You had the temple later on, rituals. On your handout, you got the picture of the tabernacle last week. Just a picture of it. That lasted about 400 years. It's easy to remember because this whole thing started in 1500 BC, ballpark. Just get a grasp on that with Moses. David, the king, Saul, David, and Solomon are around 1000 to 900 BC. It's Saul, David, and Solomon. So the temple is built right here. This is where your temple is built. So the tabernacle would have lasted about 400 years. Tabernacle worship. And then it was temple worship. Of course, it was destroyed when the Babylonians come in 606 BC over the next 20 years and then rebuilt. But that gives you a ballpark of for you of time frame in your mind for all this. All the laws, all the commandments. Now, there's more than 10 commandments, obviously. You know, read the book of Leviticus about the Old Testament laws. But all that is gone because you don't need it anymore. We've talked 100 times about all the Ten Commandments was done away with. We'll talk about that next week too. Ten Commandments was done away with. In fact, Colossians and Ephesians teach you that also. It's done away with. But that doesn't mean we don't follow it, because in the new covenant, under Christ's teaching, 9 of the 10 are emphasized again. Only the 4th commandment of keeping the Sabbath was not carried over. So yes, the 10 Commandments was done away with. But in fact, Jesus gives 9 of them, tells you to follow, and actually follow them better. Once again, better is a good word there. Higher level. Where, so you know this, but only the 4th commandment was not.
But after the tabernacle and the temple, later on came the synagogue, which was another form of the Jewish way of worshiping.
Well, when they were in Babylonian captivity for 70 years, they were captured in 606 BC, and it lasted to 536 BC. This is the Babylonian captivity. Babylon destroyed the temple. And while they were in captivity, they worshiped the best they could. When they came out of captivity, till they started, while they were in captivity of 70 years, they worshiped in groups. And out of that group was born synagogues. A synagogue is basically a congregation. So when God used that 70-year period when they could not do temple worship, they walked in the temple, they were in captivity in Babylon, they were allowed to worship in groups called synagogues, which was perfect. All part of God's plan, because after Jesus comes and after the apostles come here, you have the book of Acts, the Jews are only worshiping in synagogues. And Paul would go to the synagogues, every city, and preach and convert. And there were synagogues in almost every city. There wasn't one in Philippi. We know that in Acts 16, because there weren't enough men there. But there was a church established after Paul, converted the ladies there in Acts 16. So anyway, synagogue worship came out of captivity, and that was part of God's plan.
Even Cornelius built them one.
Last verse, 13. A new covenant makes the first old. We'll get into that again next chapter. So that which decays and becomes old is ready to vanish away. I like a better word. All this will be obsolete. The new will replace the old. And we know he's talking about less than 10 years from then. First of all, it's already gone away with. But the whole Jewish system that's still intact is going to be gone in AD 70. Wiped out. And they were scattered for the next, to 1948, I guess. We got the new country. 2 good verses there. You might write them down, look at them. Colossians 2:14 and Ephesians 3, is it 15? 15 and 16. Might read them real quick. We got a minute. Colossians 2:14. Read it a minute ago, I think, didn't we? No, we didn't. Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances against us. What are the ordinances? 10 Commandments, Old Testament laws, which were contrary to us. He took it out of the way, nailed it to the cross. All the Old Testament stuff is gone, out of the way. When Mike does his Bible studies, like in the Got Milk class and the Go Forth class and all these things we did last 2 years, he starts teaching someone the Bible study. The first thing he does is goes to here and there. Ephesians 3, 15 and 16. 2, I'm sorry. Both of them the same. Ephesians 2. Ephesians 2, 15 and 16. Having abolished in his flesh the enemy, even the law of commandments and ordinances, same thing. These are parallel verses. So to make himself of two, one man, that he might reconcile to God one body by the cross. There, again, reconciled. So Mike will, the first thing he does in a Bible study is go to these 2 verses. Why is he doing that? To establish there's an old covenant and there's a new covenant. And that's important when you get talking down the road in your Bible study about things that like instrumental music. Sure, it was in the Old Testament. What's the first thing we talked about? The old is done away with. The new is where we live now. So that comes up a lot in Bible studies. If you establish that first, and most people don't understand that. Well, I appreciate your interest. Chapter 9 next week. We're on schedule to finish this by the end of the year. Thank you.